The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The more networked and linked digital life gets, the more it's open to cyber risks. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight, we wrap our week looking back at technological change by revisiting our 2016 conversation with legendary broadcast journalist Ted Koppel. His book at the time warned of imminent risks of a cyber attack on critical infrastructure such as power grids. Then, our Ontario Hubs explained the power of something called forest bathing. Cyber attacks, as Ted Koppel predicted, have come to pass. In May, a nearly 9,000-kilometer pipeline between Texas and New Jersey, which transports nearly half of the U.S. East Coast fuel supplies, was hacked and its operations shut down. In 2020, software provided by the company SolarWinds, which is widely used by U.S. government and industry, was also hacked. U.S. agencies, including parts of the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department, were attacked and vulnerable for 9 months. So were private companies such as Microsoft, Cisco, Intel, and Deloitte. In Canada, the federal government's Centre for Cybersecurity has said they fend off 2 to 7 billion actions per day to stop malicious cyber activity. In 2015, Ted Koppel said, quote, "Cyber war is simply a part of the landscape now. It seems even more true today."
We remember well back in 2003 that about 10 million people here in the province of Ontario and 45 million Americans in the Northeast lost power because of that situation. Can you tell us the difference between what happened then and what you're writing about in your book?
Yes, what happened then was a natural event. Apparently some power lines were brushed by tree branches, and incredible as it seems, that caused a cascading outage, which, as you say, resulted in millions of people, not only in the United States, the northeastern U.S., but also in Canada, to be without power, as I recall, for about 3 days. I think 7 or 8 people died. It cost billions in lost revenue and expenses to both governments. And then the United States and Canada formed a joint commission to figure out what had happened. And interestingly enough, one of the things, and remember now, this was 13 years ago, one of the things that they concluded was that the power grid would be susceptible to a cyber attack. That was something that really no one had thought about back then, but they came to the conclusion that it could happen. And the difference between what happened in 2003 and the possibility of a cyber attack is that if someone is deliberately trying to take down the grid, they can keep on taking it down, so that the likelihood of this taking out tens of millions of people in terms of their electricity could last for as long as weeks or even months.
We can show the impact that you're talking about with a little graphic right now. Sheldon, if you wouldn't mind bringing this up. This is a map of the 4 major power grids in North America, which very clearly illustrates how Canada might be affected even if there were a cyber attack on the United States alone. And depending on whether the attack were to be aimed at the west or the east, different parts of Canada would also be affected. Can you give us a sense of who you think would perpetrate, what foreign power presumably, would perpetrate such a cyber attack?
Well, since you said which power would, it becomes a little more complex. Let me alter your question just ever so slightly by substituting the word could rather than would. The Russians could. The Chinese could. The Iranians possibly could, and the North Koreans seem to be on the verge of acquiring the kind of cyber capabilities that perhaps they could. Those who could necessarily, however, are not the most likely to do it. The interesting thing about the cyber capabilities is that those who are most capable are least likely, and those who are least capable at the moment are most likely. What I mean by that is if ISIS ever got its hands on the kind of cyber expertise to do this, they would be very likely to do it. They, mercifully, do not have that capability yet, but there are experts with whom I've spoken who believe that because they have a great deal of money, they can purchase the capability. They are the most likely to do it. Those who have the greatest capability because of interlocking interests with the United States, the nations like Russia and China, they are the least likely to do it, but they are already inside the grid. They definitely have the capability.
I note a few years ago that your former defense secretary in the United States, Leon Panetta, warned that the U.S. could be a victim of what he called a cyber Pearl Harbor. President Obama, in his State of the Union a few years ago, also pointed this out. Did those speeches, in your view, make much of an impression on your country?
No. Simply put, the answer is no, and that's one of the reasons that I decided to write this book. I was intrigued, and President Obama, as you correctly note, mentioned it not once but actually twice in successive State of the Union addresses, but it was Leon Panetta's reference to a cyber Pearl Harbor. People of my generation, and Leon Panetta is of that generation, don't lightly use the term Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor sort of conjures up an image of absolute devastation. The likelihood that there could be a cyber Pearl Harbor in this country intrigued me enough that I looked into it to see whether this really was something that could happen. The quick answer is yes, it could. Will it? All I can tell you is that the commander of CENTCOM, General Lloyd Austin, told me it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when.
Well, let me use the nuclear parallel. Mutual assured destruction prevented, I guess in part, prevented a nuclear war for all of the years that the Soviet Union and the United States had that capability of destroying one another. Is there an equivalent MAD when it comes to the cyber world?
Not really, and I'll explain why. If, for example, the unthinkable had happened, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that Soviet missiles were launched against North America, against the United States, the president's military advisors would have known about it within seconds of those rockets, those missiles leaving their launch pads. In the event of a cyber attack, one of the great problems is it can take weeks, if not months, before the origin of that cyber attack is traced. If you can't say with a definitive decision that a cyber attack has been launched, let's say by the Chinese or by the Russians, the question is, against whom do you take action? And it can be weeks, as we discovered in the event of the North Korean cyber attack against Sony. There really was no doubt in anyone's mind that the North Koreans had done it. But it still took the FBI a matter of months before they could state with certainty that the attack had come from North Korea.
Well, you do tell us in 250 pages, very well researched, very enlightening pages, I might add, that America is not ready for this. Are there other countries in the world that are better prepared to face a cyber attack?
I don't know, is the honest answer. I didn't really research what other countries have done. I think one of the problems is that the United States in particular is especially vulnerable because of the deregulation of the electric power industry. Because of that deregulation, you have all kinds of different standards that exist within the industry. We have some 3,200 electric power companies in this country. The biggest of them, the wealthiest of them, have taken enormous preparations, security preparations, to protect them and their customers against the likelihood of a cyber attack. The smallest have not. The problem is all these companies, all 3,200 of them, are joined in a network so that if someone attacks one of the smallest, one of the weaker companies, they can, with the proper kind of preparation, work their way back through the system, thereby also attacking some of the larger ones.
Given what you now know about this subject, over the next 10 years, what would you put the likelihood at that something like this will happen?
Well, if I didn't think that it was likely, I wouldn't have written the book in the first place. I think when you say over the next 10 years, I think it's all but inevitable that it's going to happen in the next 10 years.
Well, something happened in Ukraine over the Christmas break, right? And this was not the trees growing too tall kind of a power outage. This was an attack, was it not?
We don't have to go as far as Ukraine. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you look at what the Chinese have done in terms of quite literally vacuuming up 22 million private records of U.S. government employees, as they have done, it happens to be one of the greatest intelligence coups of all time. They were able to do that despite the fact that one would think that the CIA and the FBI and the State Department and the Defense Department have fairly adequate protection against that kind of thing happening. Clearly not true. What you see in Ukraine that just happened over the Christmas holidays is actually relatively minor at this point, but it gives you an indication of what can be done. The Russians in particular have been active in cyber warfare for some time. They took significant cyber actions against the state of Georgia when they felt that Georgia was becoming a little bit too rambunctious. So the fact that it's now happening in Ukraine shouldn't surprise us at all. Cyber war is simply a part of the landscape now. Well, unavoidable.
We did get a sense of what would happen in the aftermath of a cyber attack on the United States. But you go into considerably more detail in your book, and perhaps you can share some of that with us now. What would happen, in fact, if this did take place?
Well, once you're without electricity, you are without the capability of, particularly if you live in an urban center, you're without the capability of heating or cooling your home. The water supply is going to stop in the sense that it requires pumps, which are powered by electricity to get that water into the various apartment buildings, into the flats throughout the city. The worst part about that is not merely the fact that there wouldn't be enough drinking water available, but also the fact that you don't have the capability of disposing of human waste. Within the matter of just a few days, that becomes a major crisis.
You describe an organization in this book, or I guess a movement is a better way to put it, called the Preppers. Who are the Preppers, and what are they preparing for?
Well, I'm sure you have preppers in Canada as we do here in the United States. And essentially preppers are simply people who are prepared for bad things. It doesn't have to be, I talk to an awful lot of preppers. Very few of them are actually preparing for a cyber attack on the grid. Some of them are preparing for what they think could be an EMP, which is essentially a nuclear attack in which a nuclear device is exploded over, let's say, the United States, knocking out all the electricity that way. Others are simply preparing for natural disasters, be those floods or blizzards or hurricanes, but they are folks who believe that in the event of a disaster happening, the government simply is not going to be able to take care of them for more than a couple of days. And so they're people who are trying to prepare for themselves. In a manner of speaking, their patron saint frequently is considered to be Noah, who I guess would have been history's first prepper.
Did you come to any conclusions yourself as to the reasonableness of this group?
I don't think there's anything unreasonable about being prepared for bad times. I think, quite frankly, you can go a little bit nutsy, and some of these folks do. But to have an extra supply of food and water, to be able to take care of your family and to know that you're not dependent upon government sort of running to the rescue, I think that can actually be quite healthy.
Well, having written the book, I should ask you directly, how prepared are you now?
Not as prepared as I should be, but I have bought some freeze-dried food for the family, for myself and my wife and our children and our grandchildren. We do have a water supply, and we do have backup generators. Is that going to be sufficient? I don't know. I hope never to find out, but I fear that I may.
Another quote from your book: "It has never been more difficult to convince the American public of anything that it is not already inclined to believe." Why so?
Right. We live in an era of internet communications, in an era of extremely partisan radio and television programs, and people seem inclined to believe only that which they are predisposed to believe. They pick those radio programs that provide sort of an echo chamber to what they already believe, so that the liberals are listening to extremely liberal radio hosts and television hosts, and conservatives are doing exactly the opposite. And frankly, in an environment like that, it becomes very, very difficult to say to people, let's have a reasonable conversation. Reasonableness is gradually being expunged from our political process. You have only to look at the American political scene these days.
Well, since you've taken us there, let's go there. We've only got a few minutes left, and I can't have Ted Koppel here and not ask him about the silly season that is American presidential politics. Who do you think on the Republican side poses the greatest challenge to Hillary Clinton's becoming the next president?
Quite frankly, I don't think any of them do right now. But let me put the emphasis on right now. I think as long as there are still 9 or 10 Republican candidates, they are going to diffuse their capability of taking on Secretary Clinton. But she, I think, is going to have a fairly easy ride to the nomination, and the Republicans are going to be beating each other up for the next couple of months. Until the time that we see who the candidate is going to be, I'm afraid I can't tell you at this point. I would have predicted that Donald Trump, for example, would have been out of the race a long time ago. I was flat wrong.
I presume you've interviewed him or met him or know him reasonably well, given the circles you two both travel in. What do you make of this whole phenomenon?
Well, H.L. Mencken, the great Baltimore journalist, at one point said, nobody ever went broke underestimating the good taste of the American public. I think we're seeing an example of that right now.
I do remember, let me ask you about another great American institution, and that's an institution that you said, having been born overseas, not in America, that until you understood it, you could never really fully feel 100% American. And that's baseball, Ted Koppel. Do you know any more or have any greater appreciation of baseball today than you did, say, when you were doing Nightline?
Let me put it this way. I used to think that cricket was the most boring game in the world. I've revised my opinion.
Oh, my gosh. Ted Koppel, that is a very disappointing thing for you to say, but I'll let you get away with it. Let me just say in our last minute here, and I guess you hear this all the time, so I apologize in advance, but when you signed on with Nightline all those years ago, I think I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I watched it every night. And I think one of the reasons I'm sitting in this chair here tonight is because of guys, well, not guys like you, is because of you. So thank you for your fantastic career, and I enjoyed the book very much, and we're really grateful you spared so much time for us tonight here on TVO.
Well, that's a very generous statement for you to make, and to those of your fans, I'm happy to take credit, and to those who think of you otherwise, I had nothing to do with it.
You sound like my mother. She says that all the time, too. The name of the book is Lights Out, A Cyberattack, A Nation Unprepared, Surviving the Aftermath. Ted Koppel, so good to have you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. I enjoyed it.
Ontario has boreal and other forests like few places on Earth. And this summer, if months of lockdown and social distancing isn't reason enough to visit them, our Northwestern Ontario Hub journalist Charnel Anderson has one more. It's something called forest bathing. She joins us now from Red Rock on the north shore of Lake Superior to explain. Hi, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so from what I understand, there's no showers, or bathtubs or nudity involved in forest bathing. What exactly is this concept?
Yeah, no showers, no bathtubs, though it is, a really adaptable practice. So I think clothing is really up to you. So forest bathing, also known as forest therapy or Shinrin-yoku, is really just about kind of going into nature and experiencing it mindfully. So like all mindfulness practices, the idea is to engage all five of your senses, taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing. I think that's all of them. And so you do this taking your time. It's really a slow practice. It's not like going into the forest and going on a hike. In fact, you may not even walk very far, but the idea is really just to be aware of your senses. So you're kind of, you're feeling the sun on your skin, maybe the humidity in the air, your feet on the earth, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned, so it's a flexible practice, and you can do this with or without a guide. And if you opt for a guide, they'll kind of help direct you, and they may use what's called invitations. So those are kind of verbal suggestions to help you connect into the situation. But as I said, you can also do it alone. And you can really do it anywhere that there's some kind of greenery. So as the name suggests, a forest is a good place to do this. But you can also do it in a park. You can go out into your backyard, do it underneath a tree. And you can even do it inside. So if you're sitting by a window that kind of overlooks a natural green spot, you can even do it, surrounded by houseplants. And, you may not get the same benefits as you would going out into the forest, but it's still a beneficial practice.
So let's talk about the history. This isn't necessarily a fairly old concept, right?
Yeah, no. So it's so forest bathing is based on a Japanese practice called Shinrin-yoku, and so this practice was developed in Japan in the 1980s as kind of a preventative healthcare measure, and it actually went on to become part of Japan's national health program. In fact, Shinrin-yoku as a term was coined by the Japanese Department of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries in 1982. And since that time, there's been a lot of research done on the subject, which points to positive benefits, both physiologically and psychologically. So perhaps it's no wonder that this kind of thing has caught on in the West.
Now, obviously, we're in a pandemic. A lot of people are going outside, but I understand there's actual science behind, benefits to communing with trees, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a plethora of research that's been done on the subject. So some research suggests that this practice of forest bathing can help lower cortisol, which is the stress hormone that can lead to all kinds of things like high blood pressure and heart disease. Research suggests that forest bathing can improve your immune function. So I don't know if you know this, Jan, but trees emit what's called phytoncides, and it's essentially like tree essential oils. So when you cut into an onion, you get that strong onion smell. Those are phytoncides. Right. And so trees emit those as well. And they have an effect on immune system cells called natural killer cells. And so those fight viruses and cancer. And so in one study, the number and activity of those immune cells, the natural killers, actually rose in people who spent 3 days and 2 nights in the forest. And those benefits actually lasted for over a month after they took that trip. Forest bathing also has benefits, mental health benefits. So there's therapeutic effects on anxiety and depression, ADHD, excuse me, ADHD even, because there's a mental relaxation component to this. There's also therapeutic effects on what researchers have called human feelings of awe. So those are feelings like gratitude and selflessness. Forest bathing can kind of increase those. And there's just one more study I want to mention quickly. So it's called forest bathing, but as I mentioned, you can do this indoors. And so there was one small study done decades ago on patients who were recovering from gallbladder surgery. And so some of those patients were in a room with a window that was looking outside, outdoors. And other patients were in a room with a window that was facing a brick wall. And so the patients who in the rooms with the windows looking outdoors, they actually recovered quicker, and they required less powerful pain medication compared to the patients who were looking at the brick wall.
Very interesting stuff. Now, you had mentioned that, this can be done inside or out, but if someone is trying to maybe make it the best experience, is there an ideal location to practice this? Do you need to be in the wilderness or a remote area, or does an urban location work as well?
Yeah, I mean, so the nice thing about this practice is that it is really accessible. You can do it inside, you can do it outside, you can do it with a guide, you can do it by yourself. So inside, you may not get the full benefits of the phytoncides, like the tree essential oils that help boost immune function, but you still will get the mental health benefits of a mindfulness practice. As far as I know, here in Northwestern Ontario, there aren't any Shinrin-yoku specific trails that have been developed, but we're on the southern edge of the boreal forest here, so there's lots of opportunities, lots of trails that you can go out and try this on. However, in southern Ontario, actually, in 2018, the city of Markham established 4 Shinrin-yoku specific trails, and as far as I know, they occasionally offer free guided walks for people. But at the end of the day, really, it's you don't need a designated trail. You don't need a guide to do this. You have everything you need right now. You can go to a park, go sit in your backyard, and just kind of soak it all in.
You had mentioned guides off the top. Is there any benefits in, say, joining a guided practice or even a group?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, anyone can go outside at any time, right? But if you're like me, sometimes I find it hard to make the time to do this and to commit to it, even though I know it'll make me feel better. So I think, if you're like that, if you're like me, a guide would be beneficial to kind of take you through the process. And, it also forces you to commit to it. I think a guide would also be useful for people who may not be familiar with forest therapy or mindfulness practices, or someone who just may not be comfortable going out into the forest by themselves. And so there are a number of different organizations that train and certify forest therapy guides. There's actually a Canadian organization called the Global Institute of Forest Therapy. And so they train guides all across Canada. In fact, they're doing a training in Thunder Bay. Well, they have a training planned in Thunder Bay in September. But really, there's guides all across Ontario. You can just Google it if you're interested.
Of course, we're still in a pandemic. Why do you think it's important to be outside and get exercise?
Yeah, as you said, we're in a pandemic. And so what's interesting about this practice is that it was developed in the 1980s, right? And that's before the internet, before cell phones, before the pandemic. All these things that kind of keep us inside more. And, I think forest bathing, forest therapy is somewhat of an antidote to that. It's really, I think the therapeutic part of it comes from allowing us to reconnect with the natural world that, for much of humanity, humans spent most of our time outdoors. So it's nice to kind of go back to that and reconnect with nature.
Some really great stuff. Thank you so much, Charnel. And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I'm Jayan Jagannathan. Thanks for watching TBO and for joining us online at tbo.org. Have a good weekend, and NAM will see you again on Monday.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.